Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that is an exceedingly long name for a bill. Possibly the name might even be longer than the bill itself. There is, Mr. Speaker, a broad consensus among civil society, NGOs, and the industry and some governments that there has to be something done about the payments and the corruption involved in a variety of enterprises, particularly involving the extractive sector, that we need to have increased transparency and to curb corruption. Pierre Gratton, again, of the Mining Association, has said, quote, "There was a little bit of a surprise that industry is asking for more regulation, but there are business reasons for doing this. And sometimes additional regulation is actually good for business," end quote. But, Mr. Speaker, business can only carry the load so far. The best companies operate at the highest ethical standards, but they are frankly helpless when less ethical companies bribe their way into lucrative concessions. There are two sides to corruption. There's the demand side and the supply side. I don't expect that C-474, the Sunshine Bill, or any other bill, frankly, will stem the demand side. That would be naive. I would, however, we could possibly just slow down the supply side of corruption, because every CEO and every project manager will know that their company is going to have to file sworn statements that this money was paid for this concession to this government or entity on this day in a particular currency, and failure to file will be an offence. And in my proposal on 474, it will be a finable offence, and on the U.S. side, it will be a delisting offence. Maybe, Mr. Speaker, SNC-Lavalin wouldn't be in the mess it's in today if something like the Sunshine Bill had existed. Maybe their executives would not be facing criminal charges. Maybe their stock prices wouldn't have been hammered as they have in the last year. And maybe SNC-Lavalin and their related companies wouldn't have been cut out of World Bank business for the next 10 years. And maybe, Mr. Speaker, we wouldn't see the headline that we saw in the Huffington Post and the Financial Post this morning, which said, quote, "Canada has the dubious honor of being home to the largest number of firms on a World Bank blacklist of corrupt companies." If you live in some fantasy world that Canada is as pure-driven as the snow, then I ask you to take another look at that. Maybe if we had legislation in place, Griffiths Energy wouldn't have been fined $10 million. And maybe if we hadn't had legislation to fine NICO, wouldn't have been fined $9.5 million. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm not so naive as to believe that 474 would have ended all of these problems, but I do know that legions of lawyers will be reminding their bosses of their filing requirements under the bill. So here we are, Mr. Speaker, with a modest regulatory initiative with which the House could put Canada back in the game. A simple bill with a clear aim to promote transparency. It is largely, may I say, Mr. Speaker, a photocopy of the U.S. legislation. And I have said to the industry in the various times I've been speaking with them, all you have to do, or all I would propose you do, is if you have a filing with the Securities Exchange Commission of the U.S., photocopy it and send it to us. I don't intend or want to have an increased regulatory burden on the industry.
Our government is focused on a balanced approach to to economic resource development. That is why we have tough rules for companies operating at home and abroad. While the member for Scarborough-Guildwood may intend for this to be the overall objective of Bill C-474, the proposed legislation contains serious shortcomings, and our government is currently taking action to create an improved reporting scheme. For this reason, we oppose Bill C-474. Mr. Speaker, Canada is in a strong position to influence positive change globally. Nearly 60% of the world's publicly listed mining companies list on the TSX or the Toronto Venture Exchange, and 70% of the global mining equity capital in 2012 was raised on these two exchanges. Canadian mining companies have mining interests worth nearly $150 billion invested in more than 8,000 properties in 100 countries. Canada has a strong record both domestically and internationally of supporting transparency and accountability in the extractive sector. Mr. Speaker, the development of natural resources is an important driver of sustainable economic growth both in Canada and in developing countries. Done right, such development regularly creates jobs, contributes to poverty reduction, and provides governments with revenues to improve the quality of life for their citizens. That is why our government continues to place such a high priority on the related issues of transparency, accountability, and good governance in the extractive sector. Once established, Canada's mandatory reporting regime for the extractive sector will be a powerful tool, in addition to many other existing initiatives, to realize these objectives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to have this opportunity today to speak and provide my support in principle to Bill C-474, which will require mining companies, oil companies, and gas companies to produce annual reports and to disclose all payments made by them or subsidiaries as part of their mining, oil, and gas operations. This bill will make it a offence to fail to comply with this requirement and establishes a penalty between $20,000 and $5 million, which can be imposed for any offence. Essentially, this is about ensuring that Canadian companies are responsible for the payments that they make to conclude a business abroad, and that foreign governments are able to be held accountable for the money that they receive. In the late 1990s, several economists and observers spoke about the curse of resources, the resource curse, as we call it in English. They attempted to understand the paradox. Why are the two-thirds of the people, the poorest people in the world, living in the resource-rich nations? Jeffrey Sachs and others, including Paul Collier, for example, stated that nations with vast natural resources, gas, oil, and mines, couldn't achieve their full potential. Apart from a few examples, or exemptions rather, there is a great deal of corruption in many of these resource-rich countries and very little transparency. They noted that the managing of profits from the extractive industry was often held by a few elite people, a minority of individuals who controlled the country's resources. Multinational companies that competed to have access to the natural resources are often in cahoots and with maintaining these rules established by the elite. They're reluctant to provide information on their benefits and on the amounts paid to the elite. If citizens were to know how much their government could make from resource extraction in their countries, it would be easier to oversee how the money was spent. The researchers I mentioned earlier proposed a series of complex measures that were somewhat contradictory to ensure that natural resources are beneficial as much as possible to the local populations. They all agreed, however, on the need for greater transparency in order to put an end to what they called the resource curse. Canadian companies like Barrick Gold will have to submit to American rules. They will have difficulty stating that Canadian rules are causing them more damage than the American ones. Moreover, the CEO of the PDAC doesn't expect new legislation to erode the competitive environment for Canadian firms abroad, given the large number of companies that will have to disclose these payments. As the CEO has said, the biggest problem is setting up and adjusting to new accounting systems. The challenge is to establish a framework for natural resources companies so that the work isn't done twice for various states. I believe that Canadians will expect Canadian companies to use commercial practices of the highest order and that we should preach by example. The Prime Minister announced last June in London that the Government of Canada would establish new mandatory rules for the extractive industry in Canada with a view to increasing transparency as regards the amounts these companies pay to foreign companies. I'm somewhat skeptical, however, Mr. Speaker, that the government is inclined to regulate private companies. The Conservatives are the champions of self-regulation and deregulation, in fact. Bear in mind that they cut environmental assessments to please large oil companies. The government has announced consultations with industry and the provinces, and I hope that they will open up these consultations to the public. It would be somewhat odd to see discussions on transparency take place behind closed doors. Finally, I would say that I'm pleased to support Bill C-474, which is a bill that has three main objectives. One, to ensure transparency. Two, to make this information available to civil society and to the general public, and to promote the good use of this wealth. Some people will say that this bill doesn't go far enough, but it is nonetheless a step in the right direction.